Hey everyone, I'm Brett Doze, and this is my presentation on my personal ethical philosophy of sport for the graduate course Ethics in the Sport Industry at the University of Kansas. So, as an introduction, I want to go over some of the concepts that informed my personal ethical philosophy. One is the idea of sportsmanship versus gamesmanship. Sportsmanship being leveling the playing field, having respect for all participants, whereas gamesmanship, something we want to avoid, is the idea of winning at all costs, even if that means breaking the rules. Also considering the interactions in sporting events between players, fans, personnel, coaches, and also the ethical guidelines that kind of inform what I'm going to display here going forth. And some of the key themes that I came up with as I went through and formed this philosophy is the dichotomy between the more business side, the workplace in the sport industry, and the playing field where the events occur, the personal ethical foundations I came up with, and the strive to maintaining those, and the idea that the top priority should be the well being of athletes and really all participants involved in such sporting events. So one of the models that we went through for this class involved ethical theories and how we can use them to inform our own personal philosophies. One of them that I considered is moral relativism, mostly because I think moral action and ethical action is highly dependent on situational circumstances rather than there being any absolute truth in ethical thought, like the ideas of absolutism. I was really interested as well in Herka's theory of philosophical perfectionism, which basically places this idea that there is either an obligation or a choice for humans to strive for the highest possible level of human nature and ability, which I think is very common among athletes in their strive for perfection and success in their sports, and also maintaining a level of utilitarianism when working with athletes and making sure that we're not slipping too much into egoism for me to advance my own career. I really try to stick with as much as the utilitarian viewpoint as possible. Another thing I considered that we covered in the course was ethical workplace conduct and how that shows up in sports settings. I think the biggest thing that I came up with here is this dichotomy between my own personal ethics and the ethics of whatever corporation or institution I may be working with or for. Um, I think it's important to have a discussion about the ethics of the institution, but also maintain your own personal ethical and moral guidelines when you are working in such an institution. You can see this group here seem to be a partnership and they're discussing their core values. I think that's something to really consider in any institution or corporation, but also make sure that you are maintaining your own personal values as well. Kind of keeping in the form of, like I said, that first part of the dichotomy, the office setting of sports, I think human resource management is something that's really important to consider, especially in hiring standards and employment. I think it's always important to keep in touch with the contemporary age and ideas. And today that heavily involves ideals of inclusion and social justice. And making sure that you're providing an equal opportunity and really an equal voice and a spot at the table for people holding all identities, diverse identities, increasing diversity in the workplace when possible. And this comes up big in discussions of recruiting and hiring. How much do we consider different identities? I think it's important to consider candidates holistically, consider everything they bring to the table, as well as the avenues they had to get where they are. A lot of skills and characteristics show up in this process, I think, need to be considered, especially when you're thinking about concepts such as affirmative action, which is why I consider a picture of Dan Rooney here, a longtime owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He spearheaded the Rooney Rule in the NFL, which basically claims that all teams must consider racial or ethnic minority folks for positions as head coaches or higher level personnel. And there may be flaws with this theory. Some may see it that way. There are a lot of criticisms, but I think it points to the importance of increasing diversity and equal opportunity, especially in the sport field where representation is so important. So shifting to the other side of that dichotomy, going to the on-the-field issues here, one of the most prevalent is violence in sports. And when I consider the NFL, the UFC, number of other organizations, I came to the conclusion that sports can be inherently and consistently violent, and sometimes it's just unavoidable. That's part of the entertainment spectacle. And it doesn't just involve the athletes. You can see a picture here of some fans getting into a brawl at a soccer game. I'm really interested in social learning theory to where we learn these attitudes by watching and getting exposed to these actions and these concepts. I really think it's important for teams and organizations to consider safety protocols at their stadiums. And the question of liability always comes up here. While I think it's important to think that everybody is liable in some way when violent events happen, it's really up to the higher orders, the leagues, the teams, the organization to ensure that more than anyone else. Another big topic worthy of debate today is drug use in sports, and that's largely because of the prevalence of performance enhancing drugs or PEDs. I include a picture of Tom Simpson here. He was a biker who actually passed away during a race in 1967 and was found with amphetamines in his system, which he used to remain competitive. I think the conversation here needs to center on the health and safety of athletes as a top priority rather than the level playing field in this case. There's an idea that if we just allow PEDs everywhere, it would level things out and it would be fair, but that disregards the safety of athletes and the dangers of PEDs, such as heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and even death. And on the flip side, I think it's important to consider substances that can help. Medical marijuana has been shown to really help with athletes suffering from painful injuries, head injuries, and also to help as a preventive method for the opioid crisis that we see a lot in athletes today. Fair play is really hard to define, but I think of it as, once again, maintaining a fair setting, level playing field, and also showing respect for all those involved. This comes up a lot in the topic of pay for play for college athletes. Should we compensate college athletes for playing, especially in big revenue sports? And I think that's something that should really be considered. Despite the benefits they have, these athletes um, do a lot for universities, especially financially, and I think they should be compensated for that in some way. Although I also want to consider the rules and regulations that are in place now. I do think if this is happening unlawfully, it needs to be reported, such as the case of the man pictured here, Jim Gatto, who was recently involved in a federal trial involving the FBI investigation of pay for playing college basketball, which is illegal. I think it's important to follow those rules, but to also use our platform to be an advocate for these athletes if we think they deserve to be paid for their play, and I personally think that they do. Big part of the reason for taking this course is to see how it can be used in my future career. I work as an academic advisor currently. This is something I'd like to maybe consider in the future, only working with student athletes. I'm also considering careers in student athlete development. And the reason I'm so interested in that is that I think it's important to consider college athletes as more than just athletes. They are students, they are individuals with their own personal and social lives, their own dreams and aspirations. I think that has to be considered, and it's not considered enough. So I'd like to join folks like those who work here at the Wagnon Student Athlete Center here at KU in kind of helping students in that way, assisting them, providing them the resources they need through their academic journey. A case that I often think of when I consider my career is that of University of North Carolina and how they committed academic fraud by creating these fake classes for students to take to maintain eligibility. And this really obsessed me because I know it was academic advisors who really steered athletes towards those classes. And while that may advance their ability to play at this university, I think it really stunts the development as citizens, as students while they are there. So in conclusion, I want to keep in mind my primary themes of maintaining ethical guidelines, keeping the well-being of student athletes at the forefront and the top priority, and also considering this dichotomy between the business side and what happens on the field. I also think it's important to keep creating discussion. One thing I loved about this course is that we got to discuss these topics and hear these different viewpoints, and that informs our philosophies. I do think in the future, It's important to address these limits, especially when they relate to topics like race, gender, and commercialism. Involve more topics in the philosophy and expand it as much as possible as I go forward. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this. I want to include my references here that informed my philosophy and all the information I had. I really appreciate you listening, and thank you.